I'd like to welcome everybody to our virtual author talk today with Peter Robinson, the well-renowned mystery author who writes the Inspector Alan Banks series. I'd also like to thank Furby House Books for arranging this meeting for us, and Alexandra Byers, who did it. And most of all, I'd like to thank Peter for coming and making some time for us in his busy schedule to tell us all about his new book and all about himself also. So welcome, Peter.
Thank you. I have to say, schedules aren't so busy these days.
Oh.
Nobody goes anywhere anymore.
Well, we hit an exciting time because we actually opened the library this week, so we've been kind of hopping like crazy too. So,
well, that's good.
Yeah, but this is exciting. I was really looking forward to meeting you, especially because you're such a well-known and prolific writer. It's an excellent series. I thought maybe we could talk about your book, Not Dark Yet, which is your newest one that just came out. And what I thought was interesting is the 27th in his series, but it turns dark really quick, unlike a lot of your earlier ones. Did you decide to do that right away? You've always been known for not getting too dark, and yet this one gets pretty heavy duty.
Yeah, somebody said it's called Not Dark Yet, but it really is pretty dark.
Yes.
No, I mean, it wasn't intentional. Because in my mind, it was a third in a trilogy. And, you know, you have to stress that you don't have to read them all or in order. It's a different experience if you start with Careless Love, then read Many Rivers to Cross, and then Not Dark Yet. But you can pick any one up and it's sort of complete in itself, but picks up an ongoing story. And this was the last section of it. So I knew it was going to go into some dark places because, you know, the last book did too. So, you know, I was going to have to revisit again. But I don't plan my books out in advance, so I had no idea how dark it was going to get. Maybe I should have changed the title when I published it.
Well, it was interesting because a lot of comments I noticed from people who wrote it did feel that you really had to read it in order. And I was going to ask you that because sometimes you don't. It's quite comfortable your books to stand alone. But the majority of readers actually really felt you should start with book one, and yet you feel that they are pretty well standalone if you wanted it to be.
If you want it to be. I mean, ideally, you would start with Careless Love, but I mean, it's always a big problem with something like that. When you start writing, I mean, what in my mind was going to be a trilogy, publishers don't really like it because, you know, they want to say each book stands on its own, so you get more readers with each book.
Yeah.
And if a book comes out and you say, well, you have to read these first, you know, people are not going to rush out and buy it. So a lot of it is a publisher thing. But also I had in mind when I wrote it, and as I say, I don't plan things out clearly, but I thought what I'd like to do were write 3 books that told the main female character Zelda's story, which is the only thing that really runs throughout. And yeah, each book would have a mystery of its own that, you know, would be started and solved within that book. Mm-hmm. And there'd be several scenes that would feature Zelda, and you know, what happened to her would carry on into the next book. So that was in my mind, and it didn't take a great deal of you know, reintroducing things, each character reintroducing them in each book they came in. I mean, I think it was not too difficult to pick up what was going on, although, you know, I will say that perhaps with the last book, reading the one before would help. Mm-hmm. Many Rivers to Cross, yeah.
So you mentioned, so you're saying that you planned it to be a trilogy right from the beginning.
Yeah, I wanted to sort of experiment with telling a story over 3 books, each of which told its own story too. So that was the idea behind it. It was just doing something different, I thought.
That's why I was curious about that, because it's like, that would be book 25. And until that point, there were no trilogies or 2. And all of a sudden, we've got this really nice compact trilogy, whether you actually planned that or whether it just kind of fell into place like that.
Well, I mean, now that it's all done, I'm sure the publishers will like it. You know, when it comes out paperback, they can package them all in a nice little box and call it the Zelda trilogy. And so,
this is true, yeah.
I mean, but, you know, that's their job. Like my job was to write the books, and I very much enjoyed doing that, and I enjoyed having you know, the one story carrying on, because I was never quite sure where I was going to go with that from one book to the next. I knew that, you know, that Zelda was a mysterious kind of enigmatic character, and that we were going to explore her roots, and that, you know, she was definitely looking for some people to
Yeah.
get revenge on. So, you know, that was obviously a big motivating factor for her.
Well, what else was interesting in your past interviews, I noticed you've often said that you didn't really lean towards the darker, the gore, the violence, that you didn't feel it was always necessary when you were doing these police procedures. But these definitely go into that. What made you change that angle a bit?
Well, when it's necessary, I'll do it. I mean, and I've always thought that I don't like gratuitous violence in books, you know, but books that are loaded with it. But I do think that if you're writing about a violent subject, you know, the little telling detail every now and then, which may be a little gross on occasion, is going to be that much more realistic and is going to work.
Yeah.
So, you know, my idea has always been not to overdo it, but if it's necessary, then it goes in. And it did become a bit more necessary in this book, I think. Even so, I mean, it's not a grotesquely violent book. You know, there are a couple of scenes, you know, I'd perhaps rather not have written, but they had to be there. But other than that, it's more of a quest story, really, that Banks gets drawn into, and also becomes a bit of a sort of career struggle for him after he's accused of various things. So, you know, there's quite a lot going on in it, and the violence occurs here and there, but I don't think too frequently.
So do you find okay? No. Do you find it difficult to then do that, because it isn't like what you usually like to do? Although you know you're aware of its relevance, but do you find it difficult when you actually have to sit and write that violence and that in there?
No, I enjoy it. Yeah.
Oh, do you?
I mean, yeah, I mean, I'm not a violent person. I really don't, you know, much like the sight of blood. But it's funny, you know. I really enjoy writing those violent scenes and trying to get the details in such a way that, you know, readers might shiver or feel creeped out. And maybe I should have written horror. You know, and it's like writing bad characters. You know, you can have a lot of fun writing a really evil character, and it's, you know, I guess it just lets a part of yourself out that you're not used to letting out.
Oh, that would tie in with that one person who once said that a writer who writes dark and morbid has to have a morbid imagination. Do you feel that's true then?
Well, I do have a morbid imagination. You know, I always have had, and you know, so you wake up with nasty thoughts at 4 a.m.
I just can't picture you like that.
Nightmares, and I figure, well, I might as well share them with everyone else and make some money from it, you know, rather than just suffer them myself. But it's partly a matter of the genre too. I mean, it is crime fiction, and we are talking about some rather nasty crimes, and if people don't feel at some level how nasty these things are, they're just going to sort of pass by, you know, like an Agatha Christie swept under the bloodless kind of murder.
Yeah, yeah.
And, you know, that's not what the genre does these days.
Well,
no,
and that's
partly, but
yeah, and that's interesting, because your earlier books, especially your very first one, In Gallows View, which I knew, you know, you did Dedicated Man and then Back to, but it was more like almost a step above a cozy mystery. And as you've been progressing, I mean, these last ones are definitely thrillers. Did you plan to advance along that way, or is that just something that developed in you professionally as you were writing?
No, I haven't really planned anything. I suppose it might represent, you know, tastes in my own interests, and that, you know, you can get stuck writing a police procedural series if it just always follows the same pattern. And I've tried to avoid doing that at certain times, you know, just to start in a different way, or to carry on like this trilogy in a different way. And it has tended more towards, I think, thrillers than cozies or police procedurals. The first book, I mean, I actually wrote, as you say, it was A Dedicated Man, which was published second. I think it's a total cozy. I mean, it's countryside, it's relatively bloodless. And then, you know, things very quickly started to change. I mean, Caedmon's Song, which was about third or fourth song I thought was quite gruesome in certain places. So there's always been, you know, a little place for the gruesome gesture or the gruesome incident. Maybe just more of them now.
Oh, well, yeah, I think that's it. When you look at the books, they're definitely almost like the whole theme around it is more that thriller kind of feeling to it now. Yeah. So in your books, they're all Inspector Banks, although I know you've written many other things. I thought maybe we could talk a bit about Alan Banks. He's really, really changed from the beginning to the end. He's you've really developed him as a character. He's had, you know, personal things happen. He's gotten, it seems like a deeper kind of person than those first few books in that. Is that something you wanted him to develop? Do you feel that adds more depth to these detective stories than just, you know, you have like Sherlock Holmes or Poirot, who are basically, we're going to solve the mystery, we don't change. Like, do you like this character development where they get deeper?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know how long the series was going to continue when I started writing them. So, but I did know that, you know, the more books I wrote, the more Banks would develop as a character. He had to do, because I really had very little idea of him in the first books. He's not much more than, you know, a little bit of backstory and a few sort of habits and interests. The music stuck, of course, but the other things that fell by the wayside. And of course, as the series has progressed, things have happened in his life, as you say, in his marriage. His children have grown up. You know, things have changed in his job. Things have changed in society. It's become a far more violent society than it was when he first started. So all these changes are reflected over the series, and their effect on him, I think, is reflected in the way he's become more melancholy, more isolated, perhaps more philosophical, a little darker in some ways. I mean, I'm not, he still remains optimistic, and, you know, he still believes in what he does, but there are certainly hints in Not Dark Yet that he's not very happy with the world he's working in and the things he has to do to stay in that world.
It's almost like he's been a bit jaded now with all the things he's seen in that. So,
yes, yeah.
Which reminds me, all the things I've seen, do you, these autopsies and a lot of these police procedures, have you actually experienced them like personally yourself to do your book writing, or do you go more online to research the details and things like that?
Oh no, I'd probably faint if I had to attend that. It's very different writing about them. I mean, there are lots of books, and I have met pathologists. You know, I've talked to people about autopsies, postmortems, but no, I don't like the thought of attending one.
No. What I was asking is, the Inspector Banks series is based in Britain, and yet there you do have the Hanging Valley, which is a little bit in Toronto, but then nothing else. Is there a reason you chose to do your series in Britain rather than over here in Canada?
Yeah, because I hadn't been here that long when I wrote the first books, and it seemed natural to write about where I came from and where I grew up, spent the first 27 years. You know, I knew more about it. I didn't really know much about Canada then. And I was homesick, so it was a way of dealing with that, you know, by writing about it. If I couldn't be there, then at least it made me a little bit closer. I wanted to do both. I mean, I did actually write a Canadian private eye novel set in Toronto. The same year I wrote Gallows View, but the publishers really weren't interested in it. They wanted the Banks books. So it just sat there, you know, in my bottom drawer for several years, until the Toronto Star asked for a serial story to go over about a week, 7 episodes. And I actually took the novel and sort of reduced it to a long short story, or a novella. And so it was published in that form, and eventually appeared in the anthology of stories that's just been reissued, I think, in like one really doorstopper volume of all the stories.
Well, that's good to know. A lot of people wouldn't know that. They'll probably go looking for that if they enjoy your stories and that. Yes. So did you think Inspector Banks would go this long? Like, this is his 27th book.
Yeah, that surprises me. You know, it just doesn't seem that long. I can't believe that there are that many and that I've aged that much over the series.
Well, he has, you know.
Well, he has, yeah. In fact, he's aged more slowly than I have because not all his cases take place a year apart. So he's still a bit younger than me. But
It's the city living. That's what it is. The city living
it
that's
must be,
doing.
yeah,
Yeah.
it must be. You know, no, I would not have hazarded a guess as to how long the series would last. I knew I had at least 4 or 5 books, you know, about Banks in me, but I was sort of planning a career more like Ruth Rendell's. I would write a lot of standalones with the occasional, you know, the serious character story, but it didn't work out that way. And in fact, quite often I would start a standalone, but it just didn't work out. And a couple of times it happened, I realized that if I made it a Banks novel, it would work. So, you
So
know,
it started as a standalone, not with Banks, and then you switched it into Banks?
yeah, a couple that
Yeah.
happened with Aftermath, and it happened with Innocent Graves. That I wrote them first of all as non-Banks novels from different points of view, from point of view the main characters that are still in the books. But it didn't work. That the characters somehow couldn't carry the whole story themselves.
Oh.
But I realized that if I brought Banks into it and made their story a part of one of his investigations, then it would work.
Would work.
So, yeah.
You also feature music in all your books. Now, when you pick that, do you pick it particularly to fit the book and what you're doing, or does the song just come to you and you kind of write around that song?
It's both, really. I mean, you know, sometimes I want a song in which the title or the music itself might reflect what's happening in the story, either ironically or directly, or provide a kind of a soundtrack almost for it. But some of the times, you know, I mean, if Banks goes and listens to a piece of music when he wants to sit and think things over, it might be just something I'm listening to at the time and, you know, enjoying myself. So there's a bit of a mix there.
Oh, so would you be good friends with Alan if you knew him as a real person?
I reckon we'd probably have a good time if we went for a pint together, yeah.
Sometimes you do have authors who say they don't really like their characters, so I was curious to see whether you were fond or you were getting kind of tired of him, or you got some more exciting adventures ahead with him, you know, so.
I quite like him. I think he'd tell a few interesting stories. We could certainly talk about music.
You can certainly do that, yes. So a lot of readers are going to be curious about your writing. I've seen you mentioned over and over that you don't really go to your writing desk with a set plot or anything in mind. Do you just kind of go there then with a little spark and then just kind of build around it as you write?
Usually, yeah. I mean, it's not as easy as it sounds. It gets harder as the more books I write as well. You think it will get easier, but it doesn't. It gets harder with every book. But basically, you know, I'll start usually with an idea of the victim, who's really the most important character. Somebody who's usually dead at the start of the book and often violently dead. And then, of course, Banks comes in and has to start putting the story together. I mean, in some ways, a murder is the end of one story, someone's life, and the beginning of another. And what you're looking for in the books I write is what were the seeds in what happened at the end. You know, what seeds led to that in that person's life? What was it about this person that drew such a violent end, that made somebody feel they had to, wanted to, needed to destroy his life or her life? So that's how it starts for me. And, you know, it goes out from there. Banks talks to someone who might mention something that happened or somebody else. And then, you know, he'll maybe send Jerry or Annie will go out to talk to someone else. And it just, you know, when it's going well, it really rolls along nicely. But there are times when you come up against that brick wall, you know,
Yeah,
hang your head for a while and then say, I'm off to the pub.
So, yeah, and then suddenly the ideas really flow again, right?
Suddenly they do.
Yeah. So when you have your murdered person to start with, do you already know why and how they got murdered? Or does even those details have to develop as you write?
I don't know how, why, or who.
Oh,
No, I have to, and then, you know, what happens sometimes, of course, and working on a computer makes this a lot easier, is that I do have to go back and change things. You know, I'm working on one now, and I'm not sure where it's going. I'm really quite close to the beginning, and I'm not even sure how long ago the person was killed. So, you know, I've got to kind of leave that open until I decide something later on that will determine that.
so
Um,
a wing and a prayer is what we're saying here, right?
this is right. Yeah, this is right. But it's a nice feeling when it's working well. It's, you know, it's I wouldn't like, you know, to just feel I was joining the dots.
Yeah.
Although, you know, I know people who spend a long time on very detailed outline, and they say it's not like that. I mean, you're working when you're writing the outline, and, you know, you're being creative with that. And, you know, some people just need that kind of safety net. But, you know, I sort of go without a net and sometimes fall.
So when you do you just come up with the idea and have a set time to write every day, or do you just whenever it kind of the mood takes you, do you then go, I have this brilliant stuff I have to put on paper, you know, like you always see in the movies where they suddenly have to write, you know?
No. I mean, like usually the story starts, you know, sort of germinates in my mind, and usually it's associated with a place, you know, because quite often in my books that they will begin, or will have close to the beginning, a body in a specific place, which is often in Yorkshire, you know, the countryside, you know, quite often. So I'll see that quite strongly. That's a very visual scene. And then I have to start asking myself questions about that body. Who is it? How did it get there? And all these other things that I just mentioned. So that's how it begins. And I think that, yeah, it's not, and you know, there are some days you have inspiration, but mostly I'll get inspiration when I'm actually writing. I won't get it if I'm just sitting down and thinking about writing. You know, I might be midway through a scene and I'll realize, I should do this differently, or this would lead to this, and this would be really great. So it happens while I'm working rather than just thinking about what to do. But I don't have set times so much now. I used to do, you know, I used to do the morning. I used to work till about 4 in the afternoon. And now I work probably a bit less because I guess because I've got older. Also, this COVID has been very bad for my concentration and focus.
Oh
I just
yeah.
can't seem to concentrate for as long as I used to do. So it tends to go in more concentrated bursts now. But and sometimes, you know, it's getting just a little bit harder to drag myself to the computer. But once I start, I'm fine. You know,
Yeah. Some of these ideas, are there actual like events that you may have read in the newspaper or heard on the news or something that actually gets you going on these ideas, or are they always from your imagination?
No, so some of them are from newspapers. I mean, you usually though, if they're in the newspapers, it would form a background rather than the actual thing itself. Like in Many Rivers to Cross, there were a number of articles about what they call county line drug dealers.
Oh yes.
Children were being used, you know, to sell drugs in outlying villages and stuff. So I thought that would be a kind of interesting theme to work with, although I never read about a crime that was like the one that I had in the book.
Not quite. No.
But, you know, a number of times it's quite disconcerting how I write books and something like that happens. And I'll think, oh
Oh
dear,
yeah.
I hope they
Yeah.
didn't in my book.
You're hoping your book didn't inspire it, right?
Yes. Yeah, I don't think so, though. I don't think the kind of people who commit those crimes read books like mine.
That they're out there no matter what. Yeah. Now I want to do this so I get it right. So you have written from an early age. You said you've written heroic to science fiction to crime. But when you were a teenager, you were interested in poetry and you wrote poetry for 15 good years. So what made you transition from that and go into crime novels?
I got interested in reading crime fiction, you know, and I think I was still writing poetry, and you know, I read lots of novels, and I started reading Raymond Chandler, and then I read Agatha Christie, and you know, I'd read Sherlock Holmes and James Bond and The Saint when I was a teenager, but I not for many, many years, because I'd been studying English literature and I'd been reading the big names, you know. So it was interesting to get back and find out how good Chandler was, and Ross MacDonald, and then contemporary writers like P.D. James, Ruth Rendell at the time. And I thought, geez, you know, this is great. And after a while, I thought I could probably do one of these, you know, because a lot of crime novels weren't that great. I thought I could do as well as that. Even if I can't do as well as Ruth Rendell or P.D. James, I could do better than that one. So there was a kind of a challenge there. And I picked it up and started. And I had about 3 false starts. I finished one or almost 2 novels, and they were rubbish. And then I sort of abandoned the 3rd one part of the way through before I got to Banks as a character. And that seemed to work. That seemed a good fit. So I carried on with that.
Now, was it rubbish to the publishers, or did you yourself feel it wasn't what you were looking for?
Never got to the publishers.
Okay.
It was, you know, it was like practice works, like when you're learning piano and you can't really play.
That's right. I know that feeling well. Yes. Do you think you're going to write poetry again, or is that chapter totally closed now?
No, I think so. I mean, I've always, you know, made jottings over the years. I haven't written as many sort of fully fledged poems as I used to do, but I've got bits and pieces here and there. And my idea is to get up to the lake, you know, maybe between books and sort of go through all my old notebooks and copy the fragments out, see if there's anything there, see if there's anything worth developing. But I still read it, and I'm still interested in writing poetry. So it just, I think, you know, novels took over. And if you do spend as much time as I did working on novels, you don't have the energy left really to write poetry. And a lot of my descriptive writing that, you know, I kind of like poetry of place and imagery went into the novels. So I was also using a lot of the same material, but in a different way.
Yes, you can actually see it in your writing, like you said, imagery and things like that. But it was just because you did say 15 years, and that's a long time to be writing one style and then leave for. It's almost like it's 2 sides of you, you know, the mystery procedurals, and then having the softer poetry, the deeper things there. So so you also studied under Joyce Carol Oates. Can you tell us how that came about?
Yeah, well, I went to University of Windsor. That's when I first came to Canada. And I applied to do English and creative writing. I'd never heard of Joyce at that time, but she was teaching the course there. And I didn't get accepted. I'd sent some bits of prose and some fragments of poems and things. But they said you can come and do your master's in English literature, but not creative writing. So I was set to go. So I came anyway. And I'd been there about a month or so, and I gave a poetry reading, and Joyce was there. And she came up to me afterwards and said, "Why aren't you in creative writing?" I said, "Well, you rejected me, you know." And she said, "You never sent that stuff you were reading tonight." I said, "No, that's what I've written since I've been here." And she said, "Well, come and see me tomorrow. It's not too late." So I went to see her tomorrow and switched courses and ended up doing creative writing. But it was just poetry. I mean, I wasn't writing really any fiction at that time.
What do you feel was the greatest kind of piece of wisdom or style or something that she might have given you that helped you then in future years?
I think really it was more encouragement in the sense that she treated you like a serious writer. You know, we discussed work, of course, you know, all students' work, and there were criticisms, but I don't really remember much of that. I just remember, you know, being made to feel that what I was doing was okay and was serious, and it was all right for me to be doing it. It meant something. And she was very good at sort of pointing you in directions of other writers who might be helpful to your development. She used to have a big pile of books on the table by the door. But whenever I went out, she kind of rummaged through it and come up with something and said, "Try this, you know, you might learn something from this." And I usually did, you know. So it was the encouragement and just the respect, I think, as of writers.
That can go a long way, especially if people respect them, even though they may be accomplished already in that.
Well, it's one of
Yeah.
the hardest things, isn't it? I mean, you can teach someone the nuts and bolts, but I mean, you could get that from a book.
Yeah. Well, if you had to give advice to a young, inspiring writer, what kind of advice would you give then?
Well, I would say that the important thing is to stick at it, because a lot of people, they kind of think they want to be writers, but they don't actually want to write. It seems that it's not really a glamorous life, so don't do it for that reason. But you know, if you really feel you want to do it, then stick at it and try to develop a fairly thick skin. You probably won't succeed, you know, you'll still be hurt by the slightest criticism or bad review. But you know, learn to pick yourself up the ground and keep going. And write. I mean, that sounds like simple advice, but it's, I think Ed McBain sort of said, put your bum on the chair and your fingers on the keyboard.
Yeah.
And write. So if you write and if you stick at it, you know, the odds are that you'll turn out something worthwhile.
So you talked about the reviews and that. Do you Google yourself and check out what your reviews are, or do you stay away from that?
No, I stay away from that. I mean, sometimes people delight in pointing out anything bad that's said about me, so I find out about certain things, but I pick myself up and carry on. No, I don't think that stuff's very healthy at all. The anti-social media, no.
No, it can be more detrimental than anything else. Yeah. So, well, we're going to talk a bit about yourself now. First of all, what kind of books did you read when you were growing up?
All the usual stuff. I've already mentioned my sort of adolescent reading. Before that, I used to read Enid Blyton. I mean, everybody growing up in England read the famous Five, the Secret Seven, Mountain of Adventure. I used to love the William books, just William. It's about adventures of a rather naughty schoolboy. And there's another similar one, Jennings and Billy Bunter, like, you know, schoolboy books. I used to like space stories, you know, science fiction, Robert Heinlein and stuff like that, Isaac Asimov.
And what are you reading now?
And of course, Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah. And what are you reading now?
Much the same.
The same.
Actually, I'd like to reread some of those and see how they hold up, but I read all kinds of stuff. You know, I tend to do quite a lot of reading for research, so I'm reading, you know, non-fiction histories of this period and that period. But up at the college over the past while I'd been there, I've been rereading some old Robert Parker Spencer novels, which is great fun to do, you know, and Ross MacDonald, the Lou Archer stories, like old private eye novels. I enjoy espionage fiction, literary biographies. I'm reading a biography of Graham Greene at the moment, which I'm enjoying. So yeah, I read quite widely, and it's, you know, it's what took me to writing in the first place. In the first place, I loved reading, and one of the trouble with writing is that it takes up some of your reading time.
It's true. That's true. It's interesting you mentioned Ross MacDonald, because actually a number of crime writers really read all his material, and it's almost like he was a bit of a start to them. They're the one that he's the one that kind of motivated them. So it's interesting to see his name constantly come out when I've talked with different crime writers. So once again, you too read him and enjoyed him in that. So
yeah, I mean, he took it a little further than Raymond Chandler. I mean, you know, the way that it goes is that Dashiell Hammett kind of started the private eye thing. Chandler perfected it in a sort of literary way, and Ross MacDonald came and added the Freudian psychology to it, which is, there's some truth in that. It's a bit more complex than that, but he was a really fine writer, and you know, his plotting was tremendous, because you could, the actual answer was always something hidden in the past. There was always possibly some great family secret, some, you know, deeply held thing that even the perpetrators weren't necessarily aware of what was motivating them. So it did take all this psychological unraveling. It was almost like analysis therapy as much as private detection. So that, you know, they were just added that psychological aspect that you also get in Ruth Rendell and in many crime writers since. I mean, that psychology has become far more important than it used to be.
Yes, yeah, it seems to be quite, and people enjoy that. It's something they're starting to look for in that. Yeah. So if you had a book or a novel, I should say, is there one you feel that's been really underrated that you feel people should give more credit to that you read that, you know, they don't pay a lot of attention to and you feel it's a very, very valuable and notable book?
A crime novel?
Any novel.
Any novel?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's hard to say what's underrated. I mean, what seems underrated to me might actually be well known. I mean,
Okay.
I learned a lot from, for example, reading Thomas Hardy, a novel like Tess, which is a kind of a crime story, you know, and it's not taught as that, and a lot of people wouldn't see it as that. But we were talking about psychology. I mean, it's all in there, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It ends in a murder. And I think a book like that taught me that crime writing was a very wide open field, that there was a lot you could do in it. And also, again, not at all underrated, P.D. James used to say that she thought she would write crime novels to sort of learn how to write and then write real novels. But she found that the crime novels were real enough for her and went on just to write those. So I think, you know, anything that teaches you that really the genres don't matter that much. There are good novels and bad novels wherever you look.
Yes.
And inspire you to try and write good novels is a good thing.
Yes. If you weren't writing, what would you do?
I'd probably be teaching. You know, that was what I thought I was going to do. I did a master's and a PhD in English literature, and I hope to be lecturing in a university. I ended up teaching in a community college, but then the books took off. So that's what I would probably have done. I would probably have tried to get a job teaching English literature somewhere.
In Canada or Britain?
Oh, here, I think, yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I settled here fairly quickly. I mean, even though I still have strong ties to the UK and go back there and have a place there now. But no, I don't think I'd move away again.
Okay, so here's one. If you could invite two people to dinner, who would you invite and why?
These are questions that you really ought to put some time before the talk. You know, I would have changed my mind a dozen times in the last few days. You know. Well, it would be interesting to have Bob Dylan there just to see if he spoke gibberish or had anything interesting to say, and who might be a good, you know, sort of opposite for him. I don't know, you know, maybe Jane Austen. Jane Austen and Bob Dylan might be an interesting.
That would be an interesting dinner for sure.
Yeah.
And if you had to describe yourself in 3 words, what would you describe? How would you describe yourself?
Oh, creative. Bit lazy. And that's more than 3 words. I'm not going to say lazy. I'm going to say a bit lazy. You know, just and a bit adventurous.
Well, I don't see the lazy part because if you're working so hard with your writing in that.
I know. I just always feel that I could do more. You know? Maybe I could write 2 books a year or 3 books every 2 years. You know? I'm slower than I'd like to be.
Are you slower than? Yes, but that turns out the quality then, right? Quality over quantity. So. Yes. So. Well, before we wrap it up, I was just curious. You have aged Alan Banks, and he has cronies that have retired or are retiring. Is this a foreshadowing of what's coming with the series, or?
Well, it'll have to come. I mean, I've contemplated it, and I was going to have him at the next one, having a retirement party, actually at the beginning, before he retired. But I changed my mind. he's actually working normally. But I want to keep him going, but I want it to be realistic. So I found out that quite often retired police officers can get jobs working on cold case squads or investigating old case files that are still open, that haven't been solved. And I thought that would be an interesting place for Banks to go. He could work at the same place. He would be a civilian. He wouldn't be Superintendent Banks anymore. But he'd probably be working with some of the same people he's working with now, or would have their help. And he'd be looking into, historic cases.
Actually, that sounds intriguing. Yeah, actually, yeah.
I mean, I know that a lot of retired detectives go that route, and I just wouldn't want to retire him and then have to bring him back to life again, or kill him and bring him back to life.
Yeah, so sometimes that's worse when people do that, actually.
Yeah, so I just make it a very easy transition, I think. In one book, he'd be doing his job, and in the next book, he'd be doing this slightly different job without much explanation.
Well, we look forward to it no matter what you write, so that'll be excellent. Is there anything you'd like to add, or I don't want to take up too much more of your time? It's been wonderful having you. Do we have a little hint of what your next book is going to come out, or what it's about, or?
Well, I'm hoping it's going to come out next. It probably won't be the spring, so it'll probably be, next August, September. So it's a sort of early fall. Not quite sure what it's about yet. There are one or two themes that are floating around that haven't quite come together yet, but it will have an element of a past crime in that's sort of described in a way by someone who was there at the time. So there is like a secondary narrative that I'm working on. We'll see where it leads me.
And is it with Inspector Banks again?
Yes, it is.
Yes. Okay. All right. I want to thank you for joining us. It's going to be wonderful when people get to listen to you talk, because we have so many avid readers of your books here at the library.